Hey guys, tonight we start with you. An innocent time traveler dumb enough to end up in the mud-covered mayhem of medieval Europe. Yay, from castles with leeks to peasants who don't, it's a place where chivalry is killed more than hygiene. So sit back first and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and the time where you are. Always interesting to see who's joining us from across the globe. If you're time traveling to medieval Europe, your greatest threat isn't the plague or a sword, it's your shampoo. The second you arrive reeking of coconut or mountain air, well done, you've just informed all people within sniffing distance that you are either possessed, royal, or going to be burnt at the stake for witchcraft. You know, during the Middle Ages, being stinky wasn't embarrassing, it was the norm. The average peasant's odor could strip paint. Most individuals had never laid eyes on a bathtub, and those who did believe disease traveled through water. Which, to be fair, it did. But so did everything else. Bathing was viewed as suspiciously sensual. The church decided that sharing bathwater might lead to impure thoughts, which is funny considering no one could even see through the steam and filth. Public bathhouses were later closed down for being houses of sin, as if anyone could get romantic among 30 naked strangers and a deafening smell of wet cabbage. If you emerge from your time machine just showered, locals won't notice hygiene, they'll notice sorcery. They'll think you've been blessed or cursed by powers unknown. How do you smell like flowers when you reside in a swamp? They'll demand, seconds before summoning the local priest to probe you with holy water that's been sitting around for 3 years, so your initial survival tactic: become dirty right away, roll around in muck, hug a swine, bed down in hay, do whatever it takes. Your objective is to obtain that genuine medieval stench, half smoke, half sweat, and half reluctant remorse. You want to reek of someone who hasn't seen light in 3 harvests. And don't imagine the nobles were any different, they just blanketed the corruption with perfume, gallons of it. Picture roses, musk, and body odors slicing each other up with a knife. That's what a medieval banquet smelled like. Their teeth were decaying, their clothes were dirty, and yet they believed the real sinners were the ones who bathed twice a month. So keep that in mind. In medieval Europe, your cleanliness today is a death penalty. You don't want to smell nice, you want to smell period correct. If someone scrunches up their face at you, chill. That's not disgust, that's acceptance. You finally fit in. If you're going to hydrate in medieval Europe, don't. That's not drinking water, that's bacterially induced suicide. In the past, water wasn't transparent, it was a challenge. Each drink was like spinning the plague wheel and hoping not to land on explosive dysentery. The typical river was a medieval smoothie, a healthy mix of mud, dead fish, and what the dude upstream was feeding it. And by whatever, I mean human crap, animal crap, and every now and then actual humans. So yeah, people drank beer. Not for taste, not for enjoyment, but because it was the only thing that preserved civilization from drying to death. Ale was not strong, perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol. Enough to kill germs and your day's ambitions. It was small beer and everybody drank it. Men, women, even children. Imagine a 3-year-old staggering about with a wooden mug, mumbling something about grain taxes. That was childhood. Beer in the morning, beer at lunch, church, light beer out of respect. Water was so distrusted that if you turned down ale, people thought you were either crazy or up to something. Actually, turning down a drink was on the verge of being heresy. The tavern was the social center of every village, where deals were cut, tunes sung, and someone always got stabbed over spilled mead. And before you pictured warm taverns with smooth mugs and happy laughter? No. Taverns in the Middle Ages were greasy, smoky rooms filled with yelling men, dubious soup, and the crushing stench of remorse. The homebrew was generally done by a person who cut ingredients by instinct and necessity. If it didn't kill you, you overpaid them. Travelers fared worse. The further you traveled, the more dangerous the drink. By the time you arrived at a new village, you'd be fortunate to receive anything that wasn't fermented into bread. That's why all time travelers in theory would never arrive home. Not due to paradoxes, but due to intestinal collapse by day 3. So take my advice. If you find yourself in the 14th century, forget your high-tech microfiltered water bottle. Order the ale, pray a prayer, and don't question what's swimming in it. During medieval Europe, beer wasn't a drink, it was life support. If you take one piece of advice from the entire time travel guide, let it be this one. Don't fight with the church. During medieval Europe, religion wasn't a belief system. It was Wi-Fi. Everyone was logged on. No one knew how it did what it did, and if you lost signal, you were likely headed to hell. The church was not just Sunday morning. It was government, news, healthcare, and moral surveillance wrapped in one disapproving package. God got every hour of your day, and his middle management was ubiquitous. There were priests tallied sins, monks gathered tithes, bishops stockpiled gold, and the Pope sitting in Rome like the CEO of Eternal Consequences Incorporated. Now you might believe your modern rational mind can cope. You've read books. You know science. Don't. The instant you utter a line such as, "Actually the Earth goes around the sun," congratulations, you've invented heresy. That's a ticket in one direction to a crowd with a torch-wielding man, and an extremely bad knowledge of astronomy. Even questioning was risky. If you asked yourself why prayers didn't heal the plague, you were questioning God's will. If you asked why the priest had 3 horses and you could only buy a loaf of bread, you were challenging God. The only safe things to say were amen, and God works in mysterious ways while slowly backing away. And don't even consider skipping church. Attendance was mandatory. Bells clanged, everyone put down whatever it was they were doing, and off you went to spend 3 hours listening to sermons in Latin, a language no one spoke except the priest, who was generally drunk anyway. If you hadn't turned up, the neighbors would have known. And in medieval Europe, the neighbors knowing is the way every execution begins. The church ruled through education, money, medicine, and most significantly, terror. That's how it remained in power for 1,000 years. Not by persuading individuals it was in the right, but by ensuring no one lived long enough to disprove it. So if you travel back, keep this in mind. Don't argue theology, don't refer to science, and under no circumstances utter, "I'm spiritual but not religious." They'll believe it's Latin for "light me on fire, please." If you contract anything in medieval Europe, a cough, a rash, or simply a general feeling of impending doom, I've got some great news. Don't see the doctor. That's because doctor during the 14th century didn't refer to someone who saves your life.
It was one who carried a book, a robe, and a hammering sense of self-assurance. They were men who actually believed disease was created by demons, odors, or an unfortunate planetary alignment of Mars in your liver. Their methods were bold, innovative, and catastrophically in error. Feeling feverish? You're overheating. They'll bleed you so you'll be in balance, weak with it. You're chilled. They'll set you on metaphorical or literal fire. When you got a headache, they resorted to drilling a little hole in your head to allow the bad spirits to escape. The success rate was around 0. Hospitals were there, but you did not want to go. They were literally afterlife waiting rooms, busy, noisy, and strategically placed near cemeteries for quicker service. Monks operated the majority of them, so you got half medicine and half prayer, and the other half was bleeding you and inquiring if you had sinned recently. Surgery was undertaken with no anesthesia, gloves, or the slightest conception of sanitation. Instruments were not sterilized, they were wiped on the nearest tunic and reused until they broke or screamed. If you lived through surgery, congratulations, now you had a fresh new infection to kill you. Barbers practiced dentistry because why not? You'd show up for a shave and end up leaving without half your jaw. These were the same guys who'd also gladly remove your leg and then give you a discount on a haircut. So if you get ill when time traveling, don't go look for medical attention. Rest, drink ale, and pray to every deity in sight. Medieval doctors weren't evil, they were just aggressively confident in centuries of rubbish. Don't forget, in the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't curing disease, it was surviving the treatment long enough to wish you hadn't. If you think turning up in medieval Europe sporting your favorite hoodie will help you blend in, let me save your life. It won't. You may as well tattoo "suspicious stranger" on your forehead. Because during the Middle Ages, style was a crime scene and the police had receipts. Europe had what were referred to as sumptuary laws, legal fashion codes that were used to keep people in their social lane. It was simple: if you're poor then you'd better dress poor. No bright colors, no fancy material, no jewelry unless you robbed it. Even the incorrect style of hat would result in a fine, flogging, or both. These regulations weren't suggestions, they were statements of morality. Silk for the noble class alone. Fur for landowners, not goats. Velvet for anyone who could afford to hire someone else to be cold on their behalf. Regulations were so detailed that even buttons were capable of leading you astray. Some towns actually had laws about how shiny your belt buckle could be. So if you travel back in time dressed in polyester or, heaven forbid, sneakers, you'll have violated at least 3 medieval commandments before breakfast. Your space-age materials will make you appear like a devil, or worse, a showy merchant. Either way, the local priest will have a word. Even the wealthy weren't exempt. Nobles vied with each other over who was most impractically wealthy in appearance. Long pointy shoes were the style. So long, in reality, that they needed to be held in place at the knees with string. Some were almost 2 feet long. Medieval men were essentially walking around looking like fierce ducks. Women didn't do much better. Their dresses weighed 30 pounds and splashed through mud long enough to gather souvenirs. Corsets? Not quite yet. But good luck breathing under 10 layers of wool. The best survival strategy? Dress like a peasant, brown, itchy and unmemorable. Your goal is to look like background furniture, the kind that coughs quietly and gets ignored by passing knights. So remember, in medieval Europe, fashion wasn't self-expression. It was self-incrimination. Blend in, stay drab, and if someone compliments your outfit, apologize. That's not flattery. It's evidence. You might think medieval Europe is full of charming creatures. Loyal dogs, fluffy cats, majestic horses trotting through the mist. That's the fairy tale version. The real version bites, kicks, infects, or screams at you. Do not pet anything that moves. Let's start with dogs. Forget man's best friend. Medieval dogs were working animals, lean, scarred, and emotionally unavailable. They killed rats, watched over barns, and sometimes ate what died first. They were not good boys. They were mangy survivalists. If you attempted to call one over and say, "Who's a good boy?" the reply was, "Not him." Cats. You might imagine they'd be more secure. They weren't. They were half feral, angry all the time, and viewed with suspicion by the church. They actually killed cats for being familiars of witches, which caused shock. More rats, more fleas, and ultimately the Black Death. Well done, humanity. You killed off pest control. And then there were horses. You can picture gallant knights on fine horses. In reality, horses were erratically unpredictable tanks with teeth. They bit, kicked, and bolted at the slightest sound of a spoon clinking. A medieval warhorse might step on you out of sheer boredom. You'd have a better chance snuggling with a bear. Farm animals were not so good. Chickens were not adorable. They were little feathered psychopaths. Pigs were smart, but their smarts had primarily gone into planning how to devour you if you tripped and fell. Sheep. Always scheming to die of terror. Geese. Mobile security devices fueled by hatred. And disease? Oh, the disease. Rabies, ringworm, lice, fleas, worms. Every animal had something you didn't want. Petting a stray animal was essentially medieval roulette. You either got bitten, infected, or charged with witchcraft for enchanting the beast. If you travel back in time and feel isolated, don't be tempted to connect with local animals. Animals in the Middle Ages weren't pets. They were co-laborers who didn't particularly care for you. You'll encounter pigs wiser than peasants, dogs nastier than knights, and cats that know things that make hell seem to be a homely place. Say distance. Because in medieval Europe, every animal is dinner, disease, or demon, and you don't want to know the difference. If you intend to smile in medieval Europe, don't. Teeth were not so much a body part and more of a temporary rental. Dentistry did not exist, or at least not in any shape or form that any sane individual would recognize. Oral hygiene was a myth, and the majority of people's mouths resembled archaeological excavations from the pit of hell. Toothbrushes? No. Toothpaste? Not yet invented. Mouthwash? Occasionally vinegar, but mostly remorse. Peasants chewed twigs or mouthwashed with wine, which sounds elegant until you are reminded the wine was produced in a bucket. The wealthy had greater access to dentistry that generally translated into some barber known as Gregor pulling your molar out with pliers he'd last employed to hone a sword. Barbers were the primary medical practitioners because they possessed equipment and the assurance of men who never did any anatomy. You could go to a shop for a haircut and get out without your hair or your trust. Their reasoning was straightforward. If it hurts, take it out. If it continues to hurt, let the blood out of you. If you die, that is on your humors. Rotting teeth were common. Sugar was scarce, but bread, beer, and plague stress had its effects. By age 30, most had gums that looked like battlefields. The nobility did not do any better. They just kept it in remission behind perfume and prayer. A healthy smile was so rare that chronic halitosis was likely a personality defect. And no fillings, no anesthetics, no antibiotics. If your tooth ached, you prayed. If that did not work, you went to a blacksmith who'd assist by heating up an iron and placing it against your jaw. This, it seemed, ended the pain because you did not care about your teeth anymore. So if you're traveling through time, guard your mouth as if it's your essence. Don't eat the bread. It's essentially gravel. Don't drink the water. It's essentially poison. And don't trust anyone who's holding tongs. Have your mouth shut. It's your most prized treasure you have, because in medieval Europe everyone loses their teeth. Some lose them naturally, others lose them to medicine. But either way, after your visit you'll be spitting out your ale and grinning through the agony. Historically accurate, at least. If you do time travel to medieval Europe, keep this golden rule in mind. Everything that you are going to eat is out to kill you. The diet was less farm to table and more hope to God it's not poison. Let's start with bread, the universal staple and the leading cause of dental trauma. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and baked from grain so coarse it could double as sandpaper. The poorest made loaves with barley, rye, and occasionally crushed peas or acorns. Sometimes they added filler, which was a charming euphemism for sawdust, weeds or whatever was lying near the mill. It wasn't food, it was survival wrapped in loaf form. If you got to eat meat, good on you. You were either nobility or stealing from one. The meat wasn't fresh food as well. It was smoked, salted, or possessed by a ghostly spirit. There was no refrigeration, so aging was just what occurred when you were too slow burying the pig. Spices were applied not to make it taste nice but to help it blend. If dinner had a suspiciously cinnamon smell, then someone was concealing the rot. Vegetables, a luxury reserved for peasants. The nobles shunned them altogether. Too ordinary, too down-to-earth. They liked heavily spiced foods that were ornamental and tasted of moral retribution. While peasants subsisted on pottage, a stew that changed continuously in the same pot month after month. You'd add barley, cabbage, and desperation, bring it to a boil for 6 hours and serve it for dinner. A good pottage was said to last generations and likely did. Dessert was a luxury unless you count fermented apples and regret a treat. Sweets needed sugar, which was expensive. The general population's definition of a treat was ale-soaked bread, the medieval equivalent of cake if you despise yourself. And don't miss the cutlery, or rather the absence thereof. Forks were alien mumbo-jumbo, knives were shared, and spoons were used as bacteria exchange programs. Eating with hands was the norm. Washing those hands first was optional. So if you happen to be at a medieval banquet, eat slowly, smile, and try not to think about date of expiration. Everything's boiled, salted, or maybe wriggling. In medieval Europe, fresh meant hasn't killed anyone yet. Bon appetit. If you believe medieval Europe was full of great kings and wise rulers, let me dispel that myth for you. It was really full of individuals getting their heads chopped off for even considering kings and rulers. So the best advice for your journey through the Middle Ages is this: keep your head down unless you'd prefer to lose it. Medieval politics didn't make sense. You might sleep under one king and wake up under another, and neither had any idea where your village was. Loyalty wasn't valued, it was punished. Take an oath to the wrong lord and, well, congratulations, you've just pre-committed treason. Monarchs changed more quickly than they changed ale prices. Assassinations, coups, poisonings, hunting trips gone wrong. Royal deaths were effectively a spectator sport. It did not matter which side you were on, you were always in the wrong. Even celebrating could land you dead. Folks were put to death for applauding when they were not supposed to, and don't expect silence will bring you salvation. Spies were rampant. In bazaars, in churches, in inns, even in your own house. Rumors spread quicker than soap. One misplaced word about taxes and you're a threat to the monarchy. They didn't require proof, only passion. You might be beheaded politely. Public executions were a spectator sport. Children were brought along, concession stands sold popcorn. See the traitor have his head chopped off was essentially medieval Netflix. And the terrible part? The axe sometimes malfunctioned. It might require several swings. You'd be dying knowing the audience was restless. If you were of high rank, your execution was at least elegant. You were assigned a personal scaffold and perhaps a priest, but if you were a commoner, you were lucky to be beheaded. The default option was hanging, burning, or being tied to something unpleasant. So what's the survival strategy? Don't talk. Don't take sides. Don't appear to have opinions. If nobles are arguing, look at your shoes. If they're asking you where you come from, say about. Never say tomorrow. That's treason and heresy. A 2-for-1 package at the gallows. Short of that, keep your head down, your mouth closed, and your passport concealed. In medieval Europe, silence is not merely golden, it's life insurance. If you manage to survive the plague, bad bread, and summary executions, your next test will be conversation. Medieval Europe enjoyed talking, just never about anything safe, so you need to learn one very useful phrase before time traveling. Nescio. It translates to I don't know, and you should use it all the time. Medieval times were riddled with arguments that you would never be able to win because facts hadn't been invented yet. You're a 21st century traveler who's surrounded by individuals who believe thunder is God bowling and babies are made through divine lightning bolt. You may be tempted to set them straight. Don't. That's how Galileo was put under house arrest for owning a telescope. If a monk asks what you believe about the Trinity, tell him Nescio. If a scholar queries whether or not the earth moves, tell him Nescio. If a peasant asks why their cow exploded, definitely say Nescio. Any attempt to explain science will get you branded as either a sorcerer or French, and neither is survivable. Medieval intellectual debates were terrifying. They didn't involve ideas, they involved stakes, torches, and accusations. Philosophy wasn't about discovery, it was about seeing who could quote Aristotle without getting set on fire. The wisest person in the room was often the person who was faking illiteracy. Latin was the tongue of the learned elite, the priests, lawyers, and anyone who could afford to be mistaken on more than one syllable. But for you it is a defense. Pronounce Nizio firmly, dip your head slightly and they will believe you humble or foreign, not threatening. And humble foreigners tend to live longer than smart locals. If you get pulled into a theology argument and you will, just keep in mind that reason is not your ally. You can't outsmart faith with science that will never be found for another 500 years. When a person tells you disease is the result of sin, the proper response is not so much actually bacteria, it's Nizio, accompanied by vigorous nodding. Practice it now. Nizio, Nizio, Nizio. It's not ignorance, it's survival. Because in medieval Europe the less you know the less you burn. In the 21st century you live by clocks. In medieval Europe you live by bells. And they're not asking, they're commanding. If you hear one, stop whatever you're doing. The bell is God's version of a push notification. Bells ruled everything. They roused you, instructed you when to pray, when to labor, when to confess, and when to freak out because somebody's house was burning. There was at least one church tower in each town, and its bell tolled so frequently that quiet was suspect. The day was segmented into pieces of sound. Matins, Lauds, Prime, Staccato, Sext, None, Vespers and Compline. Essentially divine interval training for the spirit. Monks took all this extremely seriously. Their whole lives were coordinated by bells like spiritual factory workers. The 3 a.m. bell would call them up from matins and everybody would stumble out of bed to chant in Latin for 2 hours. The 6 a.m. bell would call them up from breakfast and tell them to eat bread that tasted like despair. Then back to chanting again. It's amazing anyone found time to sin. Peasants on the other hand didn't require a watch, they had trauma. The bells informed them when to plow, when to rest, when to pay tax and when to ask for forgiveness for complaining about tax. When the bells rang everyone heeded. They didn't inquire as to why. They just knew someone important, possibly God, possibly Gregor the bell ringer, had decreed that it was time to cease having fun. Bells weren't just for prayers, they signaled danger, weddings, executions, royal visits, or plague outbreaks. If the bell sounded at an odd hour, panic was the correct emotional response. Some bells rang so often they developed names and personalities. Big Tom, Great Peter, the Waker of the Dead. And they weren't exaggerating. These things could be heard for miles. If you're traveling through time, your initial reaction may be to ignore them. Don't. That is like ignoring fire alarms in a pyrotechnics factory. If the bell rings, go with the crowd. Don't ask questions, don't joke about alarm fatigue. The medieval mind doesn't comprehend sarcasm, only compliance. In medieval Europe the bell doesn't just report the time, it owns it. If you thought medieval Europe was all chivalry, serenades and moonlit castle balconies, congratulations, you've been catfished by centuries of bad poetry. Romance in the Middle Ages was less Romeo and Juliet and more catch feelings, catch the plague. Let's start with the basics. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and alliances, the holy trinity of disappointment. Nobles didn't marry for affection, they married for acreage. Your partner was selected when you were around 6, and your marriage vows were solemn property agreements hidden in spiritual devotion. If you were a peasant, not quite better, just more affordable. Courtship used less poetry and more mud. You met someone while milking a cow, exchanged some shy looks, and boom. You're wed because the village priest had nothing to do that week. Flirting, however, was risky. Compliment the wrong individual, and hooray, you've just initiated a blood feud. Nobles protected honor as people today protect Wi-Fi passwords. The wrongly placed smile could earn you being stabbed, fined, or brought before the local lord for intent to woo beyond your station. Romantic ambition was effectively a death sentence. And affairs? Oh, definitely. They occurred frequently enough. Discretion did not. Each noble court was a soap opera in chainmail. But if you were caught, punishment was determined by your sex. Men were reprimanded, women were killed, and priests made note of it for their next sermon. There were songs, naturally. Courtly love, the notion that a knight might love a married woman without repercussions. It was dramatic, poetic, and totally untrue. Actually, knights were grimy, women were spent, and troubadours were excluded from at least 3 duchies at any moment. If you travel in time to medieval Europe, keep your heart and your eyes to yourself. Wooing a noblewoman means death. Whistling at a peasant girl means lynching. Smiling too long even might get you excommunicated for lustful looks. In short, romance is lethal. The only safest relationship you'll have during the Middle Ages is with your straw mattress, and even that has splinters. So remain single, remain silent, and remain alive. In medieval Europe, love at first sight was generally followed by trial at first light. If you managed to survive medieval food, politics, and romance, well done, you're now ready for everyone's favorite community activity, the witch hunt. Imagine it as a medieval variety show, but the talent is creatively dying. During the Middle Ages, witch hunts were the ultimate three-way convergence of boredom, fear, and poor theology. The weather was poor, the crops failed, and individuals required someone to blame who was not the local lord. Step forward the witch, typically an old lady with a cat, arthritis, and the temerity to live alone. The reasoning was perfect. If your cow ceased to lactate, a witch had cursed it. If your kid sneezed twice, witchcraft. If your bread burnt, witchcraft. If your bread didn't burn, or particularly witchcraft, the only one who wasn't suspected was the actual idiot who was left alone in charge of the oven. Trials were lavish. You'd be bound up, tossed into a river, and informed that if you floated, you were a witch. If you drowned and sank, congratulations, you were innocent. This was deemed reasonable. Either way, the church got to take your belongings, so it was a win-win situation for everybody but you. Witch finders were experts, self-made ones with grandiose titles and dubious literacy. They'd examine moles, freckles, or birthmarks as devil's marks. Essentially, if you had skin, you were guilty. They also poked you with needles to see if you felt pain. If you didn't scream, you were a witch. If you did scream, you screamed like a witch. So what are you to do as a time traveler? Simple. Mingle. Don't cure anyone. Don't use herbs. Don't even know what herbs are. If someone is ill, say God's will, not maybe it's bacteria. Don't have a cat. Don't speak to birds. And for the sake of everything holy, don't float. Witch hunts did not happen seldom. They were a show. People arrived with snacks. The church referred to it as justice. Nobles referred to it as order. And peasants referred to it as a day out. So if the mob begins to form torches and yell witch, leave. Quickly. Because in medieval Europe, everybody's a witch until drowned. There are noises you never forget. Church bells ringing, clashing swords, a telltale cough. And this one. Bring out your dead. If you hear those words in medieval Europe, don't hang around to find out what follows. It's not a celebration. It's not a discount. It's the Black Death, the world's worst block party. The plague came in waves. And each time it did, folks went crazy. Cities were abandoned. Villages disappeared. The streets averaged out as a horror film shot with a shovel. And because no one knew about germs, they blamed everything else. Jews, witches, stinks, and the planet Mars. Essentially everything but the rats and fleas literally infesting their faces. When the carts came through town, they were picking up corpses. No gloves, no masks, no regard for self-preservation. Just men yelling, bring out the dead, while they stepped over yesterday's quota. If you were fortunate, you died quickly. Otherwise, you got to suffer a week of fever, black boils, and religious panic before joining the heap. Physicians, if you could call them that, wore long-beaked masks filled with herbs, because lavender was supposed to ward off divine wrath. These plague doctors were goth stock lookalikes and approximately as useful. They used sticks to prod patients at a distance, which in all honesty was the most intelligent medical choice of the century. The living were not so lucky. Folks ran from cities, leaving family and sanity behind. Some prayed, others drank. A few concluded the world was ending and became part of flagellant cults that whipped themselves around town like sinners on parade. Spoiler, that didn't work. So if you do travel back to medieval Europe and you hear that dreaded call ringing out through the fog, do not investigate. Do not assist. Do not research symptoms. Just depart. Quietly. Fast. In the opposite direction of the coughing if possible. Because in the Middle Ages there is no such thing as safe distance. The plague moves quicker than gossip and it does not require an invitation. If you hold your life or your skin color precious, show respect to the cart and continue on your way. Remember, curiosity did not merely kill the cat. In the 14th century it killed everybody. So you've survived the filth, famine, and fever. You've blended in, you smell like despair, and you've learned the art of not dying. Of course you begin to think, hey, medieval life isn't so bad. That is your first mistake. Because the moment you let your guard down, something awful occurs. Perhaps the harvest fails. Perhaps the local baron decides to declare war over a goat. Perhaps the sky goes black and everyone begins chanting Latin because a comet appeared, and obviously that is apocalypse. Comfort is not something you feel in medieval Europe. Comfort is a sign. You might live for years in a state of survival during plagues, invasions, and questionable bread, only to wake up one day and find that you are now the property of someone named Lord Geoffrey the Slightly Damp. Your house. His. Your animals? Also his. Your liberty? Optional. And if you moan congratulations, you're a heretic and a socialist. Even peace was not peaceful. There were constant fires because everything was wooden and optimistic. Floods killed half the countryside at least once a decade. The remainder of the time people were freezing, starving, or waiting for someone to develop soap. And if you think going to live in a castle will be the solution, think again. Castles were essentially drafty stone iceboxes teeming with irate nobles and indoor smoke. You'd perish slowly but not more cheerfully. Peasants at least possessed the dignity of freezing outside. The reality is that nobody in the Middle Ages was comfortable. They were living for the moment agonizingly and typically against their will. But they were stubbornly human too, laughing, drinking, singing in their off-key way, and enjoying a world that insisted on trying to kill them. There's something to be admired in that in a sad, louse-ridden kind of way. So when you time travel back home, do yourself a favor. Get a hot shower, brush your teeth, and be amazed at your indoor plumbing miracle. Then light a candle for the poor bastards who never got to complain about traffic or Wi-Fi. Because comfort, the kind we take for granted, is the one luxury nobody in medieval Europe ever had. The Roman arena was not an arena of mercy. Under the blinding sun and deafening roar of crowds, men lived for their lives, their sweat commingling with sand and blood. But occasionally the mob would fall silent, and an awe other than the normal lust for blood fell over it. For instead of tough, scarred men entering the arena, it was women. They were known as gladiatrices, female gladiators, and they undermined everything Rome believed about honor, gender, and spectacle. They were the empire's secret obsession. Clad as Amazons, armless, with sometimes one bare breast bared in symbolic emulation of the legendary battle maids, they battle with poise and ferocity. Bronze greaves glinted on oiled legs. Helmets with plumes or feathers masked their faces but not their resolve. To the Romans, who held womanly modesty to be a virtue and public fighting to be a man's obligation, the spectacle was both exhilarating and unsettling. Most gladiatrices were not volunteers. They were mostly slaves or war prisoners, sentenced to entertain the masses through bloodshed. But a few came voluntarily, aristocratic women lured by glory, defiance, or lust for illicit freedom. Ancient authors such as Juvenal ridiculed these women of high station, sneering that they discarded the distaff for the sword. But the reality was the arena provided them with something Roman society could never, a flavor of equality no matter how violent. They trained in special schools, mastering the forms of sword, shield, and trident. Picture the ring of steel, the cadence of footsteps, the deliberate breathing before impact. They sparred the same way as the men, fighting their way to the right to stand on the sands of the amphitheater, where life and death hung in the balance by the flick of a thumb. Their games were sometimes ignited by torches, arranged as oriental spectacles, half slaughter, half theater. The crowd stared not just at their prowess, but at the very temerity of women combatants behaving like men. And although the empire attempted to remove them from history, faint traces survived. A marble relief in Halicarnassus of two women, Amazon and Achillea, lifting their arms in salute, an inscription in praise of a woman gladiator who fought well and was manumitted. They were few but actual, and for a fleeting defying moment they owned the arena. Gladiatorial training as a gladiatrix was a vicious metamorphosis, a falling into discipline, suffering, and display. For the majority of the women who came into the ludus or gladiator school, their way of life ended at the entrance. Inside they were no longer wives, slaves, or nobles. They were in training to be fighters, owned by the arena, molded by the Lannister, the trainer who controlled their destinies. Training grounds were merciless. Swords made of wood first to find form and balance, then heavier weapons designed to strengthen and condition. They trained on strikes, parries, and footwork under the pitiless gaze of their masters. The air was thick with sweat and iron. Each error was addressed with a bellow or a blow. But soon rhythm took the place of hesitation. A female who once bore baskets or spun wool might now swing a gladius with deadly accuracy that would cleave bone. Diet was included in their conditioning as well. Far from popular myth, male and female gladiators were not chiseled fighters of hard muscle. They ate coarse barley gruel, beans, and ashes, forming a soft padding of fat around their organs that deflected mere slashes. The irony was almost poetry. The empire that celebrated beauty and perfection sired its heroes out of brusqueness and scars. Nevertheless, training wasn't solely in combat, it was theater. Gladiatrices were trained to fight with panache. A grand entrance, a provocative stance, a calculated delay before the coup de grace. These were not just frills, these were tactics. The audience wanted drama, not effectiveness. The lanista would set them against exotic creatures or foreign warriors, staging their victories and deaths for the ultimate show. And although outnumbered by the men warriors, the gladiatrices earned the respect of their colleagues. Most of the men, at first condescending, learned the hard way not to underjudge them. Strength could be equalized, but quickness and wit, those were their real weapons. Some accounts refer to the fact that female recruits were even instructed in the ludus magnus, the central gladiator school close to the Colosseum, where occasionally emperors themselves went to watch training matches. There, a few gladiatrices became local celebrities, admired by nicknames such as Amazonia or Livia the Blade. Each drop of blood spilled during training brought them nearer to the arena, a platform where they would battle not only for their lives, but for the unattainable dream of being remembered. On the day of the games, the city was abuzz with excitement. Banners waved over the amphitheater, drums rolled through the city, and the scent of roasting meat and sweat clung heavy in the air. From morning till evening, tens of thousands watched Rome's biggest fixation, death as entertainment. But when the announcer spoke the names of female gladiators, the roar of the crowd altered. It became almost shock with a touch of amusement and lust. The women took to the sand with calculated elegance, their armor shining under the sun or torch. To the Romans it was a scandal disguised in spectacle. They shouldn't have been there. Women should be beautifying temples, not defiling them with blood. And here they were, warriors shrouded in mythic imagery, some in Amazon costume from Greek mythology, others bare-chested and insolent. Their very presence was a rebellion. The games were preordained ritual. Trumpets sounded, the emperor gave the signal, and the bout was on. The women battled with unexpected ferocity, shields meeting, swords glinting, sand flying up under sandals. Every step was calculated, not to stay alive so much as to entertain. The people required skill and brutality, and the gladiatrices provided. Every tap, every slash, every parry was drama inscribed in gore. They battled other women, occasionally men and sometimes beasts. Lions, boars, even leopards were let loose in the arena. Silk-haired women fought off fanged death amidst gasps of the crowd. And while most battles ended in mercy or exhaustion instead of slaughter, the boundary between show and death was thin and merciless. Roman authors wrote about these games in fascination and revulsion. Cassius Dio described Emperor Domitian hosting evening games in which women fought by the light of torches, their bodies shining with sweat and oil in the dance of flame. It was erotic and terrifying, a deliberate oxymoron that held Rome's people transfixed. For gladiatrix, every bout was a risk, death, shame, or fame. Some were killed and never remembered. Some struggled so valiantly that the mob called for their liberty, shouting Missio, let them go. At the moment, as the mob roared its approval and the emperor lifted his hand, a woman who once had been property became, for a fleeting moment, a legend. To grasp the popularity of the female gladiator, one must turn to the myth that gave birth to her, the Amazon. To the Romans, Amazons were fantasy and terror, women who fought, conquered, and existed without men. They lived in paintings, in poetry, and on villa walls, embodying all that Rome both honored and reviled in the feminine soul. When women warriors entered the arena attired in the likeness of these legendary combatants, they made those fantasies real. Artists and promoters heavily relied on this imagery. Gladiatrices were usually assigned stage names such as Achillea, Amazon, or Penthesilea, named quite openly after the heroines of Greek myth. Their armor, consciously stylized, copied the appearance of mythic Amazons, naked arms, one breast bared, short tunics that gave full range of movement and left little to the imagination. It was conscious theater. The crowd was intended to view them not only as women, but as representatives of something wild and threatening. But underlying the symbolism was a silent irony. The Amazons are reputed to have inhabited territories outside of civilization, Scythia, the borders of the world. They were barbarians by Roman ideals. So when the empire marched its own women around as Amazons, it was spectacle and declaration of domination, a reminder that Rome could subdue even its fantasies, making them fight and die at the will of the crowd. The women themselves, nevertheless, often suffused themselves with the very opposite of submissiveness. Enslaved or free, their very appearance in the arena negated centuries of Roman moral strictures. They confused virtue with vice, shame with courage. Some in the crowd would have jeered or laughed, but others, perhaps discreetly, would have felt admiration. Roman poets such as Statius wrote about these warriors with fascination, not knowing whether to curse or adore them. They were monstrous, he wrote, and yet they could not help themselves. Their ambiguity echoed the Amazon myth itself, half nightmare, half fantasy. Statues and mosaics from the provinces to the east took this obsession in stone and color, women with swords suspended mid-swing, muscles contracted, faces calm. These were not portraits of victims, but of peers, warriors cut in the idiom of defiance. And for a fleeting golden moment, the gladiators were something greater than myth or fad. She was the living Amazon of Rome, a spirit of rebellion gilded in bronze and blood. To win in the arena meant more than to survive, it meant to be transformed. For a gladiator, winning meant food, presents, glory, and once in a great while, freedom. In a society in which most women's names didn't survive, these ones became myths whispered around campfires and in back rooms. Their tales traveled from tavern to tavern, from senator to slave. When a female combatant emerged victorious, the arena exploded. Flowers were scattered in the sand. Men cried out her name with inebriated admiration. Patrons carved her image on oil lamps and plates. The instant she stood over a defeated foe, sword aloft. To the Romans, it was shocking and alluring, a woman demanding notice, authority, and applause. The highest honor a gladiators could attain was missio, formal release from fighting, bestowed by the emperor or the crowd. Her freedom was represented by the wooden sword, the rudis. Few ever attained it, but they were immortalized. Inscriptions have been discovered honoring women who fought well and were freed. These were not submissive housewives, they were conquerors of men and destiny. But glory in the arena had a sinister price. The moralists of the empire loathed the image of women who pursued glory on the battlefield. Philosophers and senators vented that such exhibitions were corrupting Roman virtue. When women fight, wrote one critic, modesty perishes. It was greater than outrage, it was terror. The thought of women embracing power, violence, and public acclaim terrorized the social order. Even emperors were conflicted. Domitian loved to host spectacles with female fighters, but later emperors denounced them. Under the Emperor Septimius Severus during the early 3rd century CE, the prohibition became legal. Women were not allowed into the arena. Rome had indulged its fantasy long enough, and now it shuddered at what it had done. Numerous gladiatrices were lost to history, their triumphs erased by fiat. Their names carved from monuments, their faces in sand. But their reputation had lasted, in shattered pieces of marble, in graffiti and admiration of their art, and in myth that they were. They were more than the novelties of amusement. They were women who, for a brief moment, took the type of power Rome said they could never possess, and made the empire see them, not as decorations but as fighters. By the 3rd century CE, the gladiator days were numbered. Rome was transforming, its empire stretched to the breaking point, its moral compass swinging away from spectacle and towards self-control. The same aristocracy that had long shelled out fortunes to see women fight under the light of torches, came to call it a scandal. Once exhilarating, it now became obscene, and the emperors, ever concerned with appearances, acted to extinguish it. Emperor Septimius Severus was the nail in the coffin. Somewhere around 200 CE he issued a decree prohibiting women from acting in the arena. His stated goal was moral reform, a campaign to restore the honor of Roman womanhood. But his rhetoric concealed something more, something profound, fear. To see women engaging in combat, and occasionally victorious, challenged the patriarchal ideal of the empire. A female champion in the arena was unnecessary entertainment, but she was unnecessary embarrassment to every Roman who held that women ought to be silent, compliant, and invisible. Senators approved the ban as a return to virtue. Poets mourned the loss of modesty. The same hands that threw roses now appended edicts of condemnation. The public was torn though. Some lamented the loss of the excitement, the novelty of women who glided like dancers and stabbed like killers. Others murmured that Rome was weakening, that the empire that had once reveled in strength now hid behind laws of morals. The ban did not quiet all. There is evidence that in minor provincial arenas female combatants continued to show up for years after, sometimes masquerading as men, sometimes openly challenging the law. The empire was large and decrees from Rome took a long time to reach. Governors in frontier cities were less interested in ethics and more interested in gathering crowds. There, the gladiator spirit would not be extinguished, but as Christianity spread and even the games slowly died off, people forgot about these women and they became myth. Historians disremembered them, or distorted their exploits into cautionary tales. Marble reliefs testifying to their victories were entombed or smashed. When the gates of the Colosseum shut for the final time, hardly anyone recalled that women had ever fought there at all, but even in forgetfulness they persisted. Their silence was a rebellion, a phantom reminder that once in Rome's center women stood firm under the gaze of emperors and gods. When the gladiatrices disappeared from the arena, Rome did what it always did with unwelcome realities, it revised them. Historians wrote of great generals and good men, but the women who had shed blood in the sand were silently removed. Their names disappeared from scrolls, their faces from frescoes. What remained was piecemeal, a marble relief over here, a piece of inscription there, rumors of a period when women also struggled under the eye of the empire. One of the most compelling artifacts is the Halicarnassus relief, with two female warriors, Amazon and Achilles. Both stand tall, weapons aloft, their bodies lean and muscular. The following inscription proclaims the match a draw, a product of mutual respect, unusual in the arena's brutal mathematics. They were not slaves fighting for entertainment, they were equals, warriors whose ability drew the crowd's respect. Graffiti and mosaics have also revealed women in armor, their names long forgotten but their stance clearly defiant. Every artifact is a spectral reminder that their lives were fact, not myth, and yet scholars for centuries preferred to disbelieve them as allegory, as artistic fancy. It was preferable to believe in mythic Amazons than that Roman women had once fought with swords. In reality, this erasure was no mistake. The moralists of the empire, and subsequently the early Christian chroniclers, wanted to purify history of such sins. A woman who struggled for blood and honor didn't belong to the script of obedience and piety they wished to uphold. For them, gladiatrices were not heroines but gender heretics, signs of Rome's corruption and downfall. But history seeps through the debris. New digs and rereadings of old texts have returned these women to light. Their presence, once denied, now complicates the story of Rome itself. They reveal an empire far more diverse, daring, and contradictory than its marble monuments suggest. And so, while the Colosseum stones still stand, they hold within them echoes of women whose courage defied centuries of silence. Their memory is broken, but it lasts, inscribed in the dust of the arena floor, in the shine of a bronze sword, and in the indelible truth that power, once taken, can never be fully obliterated. Centuries after the final torch went dark in the Colosseum, the gladiatrix was resurrected, not in body but in mind. Artists, historians and filmmakers started to uncover her history, intrigued by the contradiction she embodied. A woman both enslaved and empowered, brutal and elegant, a creation of Rome's brutality and hers alone. What was once forgotten came back as legend. During the Renaissance, scholars researching ancient reliefs came across representations of women warriors and wondered at their significance. Were they mythic Amazons? Goddesses? Or something more human and more dangerous to the order of history? By the 19th century, archaeologists had confirmed what the ancients once knew.